share my screen. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to present and talk about the economy tonight. So again, thank you so much for being with me. I know it is, in fact, the night of the NBA final and Phoenix is up by 3 and all those kinds of things. But given how many timeouts are called during the end of the first half and the end of the second half, I suspect by the time I'm done, they'll still be in the third quarter. So, it should be fine. I want to give you a presentation first on the economy. Use the chat feature if you'd like, if you've got any questions, and I'll be monitoring the chat as best as I can. And then, I'll try to answer the questions in the so-called run of play as I'm going through the material. But if I don't, then please know that I'm going to work very hard to answer those questions at the end of my prepared or ill-prepared comments. My presentation today or tonight is entitled Anirban Basu and the Chamber of Data. This is a Harry Potter themed presentation. You'll see that Harry Potter theming throughout this evening's presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it is baked into the cake at this point. So let's begin with our discussion of the economy. And of course, I think you would agree that the single most influential factor shaping economic outcomes continues to be COVID-19, at least globally. I know many of us Americans can see light at the end of the tunnel, though I know that in Los Angeles County, for instance, recently they have reimposed mask mandates, at least in certain contexts, and we see more lockdown measures in other parts of the world as well. But anything that changes behavior has implications for the economy, and anything that has implications for the economy has implications for real estate. And that's what we want to do tonight. We want to talk about the macroeconomy, but we want to talk about it in the context of how that might shape how people live, where they shop, what they buy, and what that means, of course, for real estate. And I know that the people on this conference call or this presentation, this webinar, are fluent in the languages of real estate economics, or at least will be. We talk regularly about cap rates and other kinds of jargon that come out of real estate. But I'm not going to be too jargony tonight, at least with respect to commercial real estate or residential real estate. We're going to talk about nitty-gritty basic issues, but I might use some jargon talking about the economy. So again, if it gets too jargony, please tell me, and I can try to address those during Q&A. So not every American family looks like this, of course. Some do, most don't. But for many months, of course, we're prisoners of our homes, and that altered behavior. So I'm guessing that many of us had not been on a Zoom conference call before the pandemic. Some had been, some hadn't been. Some people had never been on Amazon to shop. Some people. A lot of people had never used Instacart to get groceries. So behavior has changed, and now people are familiar with these technologies. And again, that means that some of these behavioral shifts that were introduced during the pandemic may persist into the long term, and we want to pay attention to those things. So let's begin with the global economy. So this is a map from the International Monetary Fund. It's a reflection of 2020 growth in various parts of the world. On this map, green is good because green signifies growth, and you see some growth here. You see some green here.
We need to see your screen, Aaron, Dr. Basu.
Do you see my screen?
No.
Oh my God! It says I'm screen sharing.
Wait, let me see here.
I see it, Bob.
Okay.
We see it.
Okay, I got my dual monitor. It's on the other side. Okay.
Okay, good. I'm glad, Professor. I'm glad people can see this.
My fault.
No.
Good.
No, we agree. It's completely your fault. But don't worry about it. You are forgiven. So, like I say, green is good because green signifies that the economy is grew in 2020. And you might be surprised to see a fair amount of green here. And again, most notably in China, the Chinese economy growing 2.3% last year, in part because of the Americans. Because during the pandemic, of course, we bought many retailed items. We're shopping online a lot. China is responsible for about a quarter of global manufacturing. So we ended up stimulating their manufacturing supply chain, helping them to grow. They were not alone, however. You can see east of the Caspian Sea, nations like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan growing economically. These are natural resource intensive societies. You can see the same thing in Western Africa. Now, in North America, you can see red. Red is bad because red means the economy shrank in 2020. I can offer you some additional granularity around this. This next slide, same data source, International Monetary Fund, but now actual statistics. So if you look toward the bottom of the slide, you can see that estimated 2.3% growth rate for the Chinese economy last year. If you look toward the middle of the slide, you can see the estimate for America, our economy shrinking around 3.5% last year. We are not the worst performers in North America, that's for sure. That distinction or dubious distinction belongs to the Mexicans. That economy shrinking more than 8% last year. The Canadian economy shrinking more than 5%. And North America was not the worst performer. That distinction might very well belong to the Europeans. You can see here the Italian economy shrinking nearly 9%, the French economy more than 8%, the Spanish economy shrinking 11%, and the United Kingdom with its worst year since 1709, and of course the year of the Great Frost. And so, the worst year for them in more than 300 years. Now, for me to indicate to you that the U.S. economy shrank 3.5% last year would be A, accurate, and B, would miss out on a ton of nuance. There were moments during which the U.S. economy performed perfectly dismally last year, but there were also moments during which the U.S. economy came back with extraordinary rapidity. This is quarterly gross domestic product. This is our broadest measure of U.S. economic output. Now, there's two colors of bars here, blue and red. The blue colored bars are indexed to the left-hand axis, the red colored bars to the right. I had to bifurcate the vertical axis, which sounds and is excruciatingly painful. I'll talk about why I did that in a second. Now, the last blue-colored bar here, reading from left to right, on the right, the last blue-colored bar is the fourth quarter of 2020. Sorry, the fourth quarter of 2019. The last pre-pandemic quarter, the fourth quarter of 2019. So you might remember that coming into 2020, the U.S. economy has plentiful momentum. What was the principal challenge for employers around that time, or many employers? Can't find workers. Well, that matters for real estate, because if I can't find workers, I can't increase my staffing levels. If I can't increase my staffing levels, then I don't need more office space or flex space or other kinds of space, warehouse space, so on and so forth. Can't increase the staffing. So that's where we were in late 2019 into 2020. We added jobs in January of 2020. This nation added 289,000 jobs in February of 2020. But of course, we shut down the economy in March of 2020, especially, particularly during those last 3 weeks of March of 2020. So the first red color bar here is the first quarter of 2020. So the last blue color bar is the fourth quarter of 2019. The first red color bar is the first quarter of 2020. And again, we came into that quarter with lots of momentum, but then the last 3 weeks of that quarter were so horrendous, it took the entire quarter down with it statistically. During the first quarter of 2020, the American economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis. Now that by itself is big news. During the fourth quarter of 2008, which had been the worst quarter of our economic lives, the U.S. economy shrinks 8.4% on an annualized basis. So a negative 5% print is newsworthy. Unfortunately, this time around, it was merely the appetizer. For during the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy shrinks 31.4% on an annualized basis. That's that big negative red bar that you see there. That's the second quarter. And around that time, there was a big debate about what the initial phase of economic recovery might look like. Would it be U-shape, L-shape, Nike swoosh, a square root, check mark, hockey stick? It was a straight-up V. The V for vibrancy or vitality or a partial restoration thereof. For during the third quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy bounces back, growing 33.4% on an annualized basis, demonstrating that under the right conditions, the U.S. economy is capable of enormous recuperative power. And we'll want to keep that in mind as we get toward the end of this presentation, where during which I'll give you a forecast for the balance of 2021 into 2022. Now, for reasons we'll get into, during the fourth quarter of last year, the U.S. economy starts to lose momentum, but then stimulus is injected into the economy on December 27th of 2020, then again on March 11th of 2021. That helps to increase the pace of growth, and during the first quarter of 2021, which is the last red colored bar here, the U.S. economy grows 6.4% on an annualized basis. Now, we are through the second quarter of the year, of course. We're now in July, but we don't yet have second quarter gross domestic product data. That will come out on the 30th of this month. Best guess is during the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy grew 7 to 8%. It is still the case, however, that despite that recovery enjoyed during the latter stages of 2020, that the U.S. economy ends 2020 smaller than it began the year, And there are many implications to a shrunken economy. Let's start talking about those, and let's begin with a discussion of the U.S. labor market. Again, more Harry Potter theming, you'll see a lot of this. There's just no way around it. But in any case, lots of lost jobs. Let me show you a slide now that looks very much like the previous graph. But now, instead of being quarterly GDP, this is monthly employment change in America. Again, blue-colored bars, that's to the left-hand vertical axis, red-colored bars to the right. The last blue-colored bar here is February of 2020. February of 2020. Now, February of 2020 represented the culmination of a 113-month period during which America added jobs each and every month, with one exception, February of 2019, for weather-related reasons. And over that 113-month period, America added 22 million net new jobs. We drove the official rate of unemployment down to 3.5%. That was a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. I'm from Baltimore, I know such things. If you're very lucky to root for the Dodgers, obviously world champions. We haven't seen a world championship around here, at least in baseball, since 1983. In any case, so February of 2020, lots of momentum, but then we shut down the economy. So it was like an express train hits a brick wall, the train stops and actually starts moving backwards. Now, the first red-colored bar here is March of 2020. Again, those are indexed to the right-hand axis. In March of 2020, America loses 1.7 million jobs as we shut down the economy. But that figure is misleading. And one of the things that I want to talk about during this presentation is that statistics need to be interpreted carefully. They can be misleading. In particular, with respect to that March 2020 jobs report, the so-called reference week. The week in which the underlying survey was conducted was early in March. So a lot of the jobs lost in March did not show up in the March 2020 jobs report. They would show up in the April 2020 jobs report, also the jobs lost in April, of course. And in April of 2020, this nation loses 20.7 million jobs. If you do the math on that, between March and April of last year, we lost as many jobs as we had added for the previous 113 months, just in a few weeks. And around that time, the Wall Street Journal conducted a survey of economists, mostly economists who work for large U.S. financial institutions, not small business operators like myself. My company's name is Sage Policy Group Incorporated, founded in 2004. And those economists collectively predicted that in May of 2020, America would lose another 8 million jobs. But they were wrong. We did not lose 8 million jobs in May of 2020. We added 2.8 million of them, followed by 4.8 million jobs added in June of last year, and then 1.7 million in July, and then 1.6 million in August, and 716,000 in September, and 680,000 in October. Phenomenal. Again, that V-shaped recovery. Now, again, for reasons we'll get into, during that fourth quarter, we start to lose momentum. By December of last year, we're losing jobs again. Again, we'll talk about the dynamics around that. Stimulus December 27th, stimulus March 11th of this year, and so we've been adding jobs ever since, culminating with the June figure, the June month, a month during which America added, according to the preliminary estimate, 850,000 jobs. So that's pretty impressive. True, April and May had been disappointing in terms of job creation, particularly April, a month during which we added 300,000 jobs. As you have heard, many employers are struggling to fill available positions. According to the most recent data, there are 9.2 million available jobs in America, but the labor force participation rate is still stuck at only 61.6%, and employers, for a variety of reasons, are having difficulty filling those available positions, and that is causing the economic recovery to be less robust than it otherwise would be. Now, even though I would characterize the initial phase of recovery as being V-shaped, please don't get me wrong. We are nowhere close to complete recovery. If you compare February of 2020 employment in America versus June of 2021, now why this comparison period? February of 2020 is the last pre-crisis month in America with respect to the pandemic. June of 2021 is the last month for which you have data. We're still in July, obviously. So if you compare those 2 months, that 16-month period, we're down 6.8 million jobs. Now, these horizontal bars represent the number of jobs lost by each of these industry categories. And you can see here, the number one sector losing jobs is leisure and hospitality. That's your restaurant and hotel work. And obviously, these are the workers that were most impacted by social distancing mandates. Now, let me show you some regional data. This is employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. February 2020 versus June of 2021, that same 16-month comparison period. I'll be using that comparison period a lot. Pre-pandemic versus latest month. Now, this is a mistitled slide, that's for sure. There's no job growth here. There's no employment growth here. Every one of the nation's 25 largest metropolitan areas lost jobs on this 16-month basis, but some regions held on to a much higher share, a much higher fraction of their pre-existing base of employment. At number one, San Antonio, Texas. Who's the governor of Texas? It's Greg Abbott, of course, much in the news recently. Greg Abbott was one of these governors very aggressive in keeping his economy open as much as possible during the crisis. At number three, you can see another Texas market, that's Dallas. At number four, tied for number four, at least Tampa. Not enough that they won a Stanley Cup, not enough that they won a Super Bowl. They call themselves Champa Bay, by the way. But one of the more stable economies during the pandemic, and that had a lot to do with public policy. Who's the governor of Florida? Ron DeSantis, of course. Ron DeSantis, again, one of these governors very aggressive in keeping that economy open. At number six, Phoenix. Who's the governor of Arizona? Well, I think you know based on where you're from. It's Doug Ducey. Doug Ducey, again, one of these governors very aggressive in keeping his economy open, particularly relative to governors in neighboring states like New Mexico and California. At number seven, Atlanta. Who's the governor of Georgia? It's Brian Kemp, of course, also much in the news recently. Brian Kemp was the first to reopen his economy, happened on April 20th of last year. And occasionally, you will hear Georgians suggest that they never really shut down their economy. Not the folks from Atlanta necessarily, but other parts of Georgia, we never really shut down our economy. Now, the bottom of the second column shows you the regions that lost the most jobs as a fraction of their pre-existing base of employment. At number 25, Orlando. And you might say, sir, I know it's late in Baltimore. You're probably getting sleepy. I don't know if you know, but that's in Florida. That's Governor Ron DeSantis. Same state, same governor. What gives? What's your narrative, sir, on this evening? Yes, it is same state, same governor. It's Ron DeSantis. But Orlando, of course, has a different economic structure. It's theme parks, leisure hospitality, retail trade. It's about in-person experience, not about remote work, for instance. And so that's the kind of region that was hammered by the pandemic, similar to Las Vegas, for instance, where the casinos were shut down. Now, at number 23, San Francisco. Number 24, Los Angeles. Who is the governor of California? Well, you know, it is the wickedly handsome Gavin Newsom, himself could be a Hollywood actor. And he was very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. And I'm not criticizing that. Some governors were more focused on the economic and employment outcomes. Other governors more focused on the public health outcomes. And of course, some of the large California markets were early stage viral epicenters. So that's for you to decide what the policymaking should have been during the course of the pandemic. My simple point as an economist is that such policymaking has major economic consequences, including for real estate. Right? Because if you're shutting down the restaurant sector, all of a sudden you have a group of restaurants that can't pay rent. Or if you're shutting down malls, all of a sudden you've got a bunch of retailers who can't do the same thing. And that affects commercial real estate values, so on and so forth. Now, number 22 is New York Metro. That's, of course, Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, his counterpart in New Jersey, Phil Murphy. Again, very aggressive in keeping that economy locked down. New York City was an early stage viral epicenter. 21, San Diego. Again, that's California. 20 is Miami, Florida, but a market that depends heavily upon foreign leisure travel as well as foreign real estate investment. That's that Brazilian money and all that, but that kind of shut down that investment in real estate, and the Miami economy took it on the chin. Unemployment. So, as I said earlier, we came into the crisis with a 3.5% rate of unemployment. By April of 2020, that's the big peak you see here, we're at 14.7 to 14.8%. Now, here I'm offering you some additional granularity. I'm showing you male unemployment in blue, female unemployment in green, overall unemployment in red. Now, during the Great Recession, the previous economic downturn, 2007 through 2009, men suffered relatively more. And that had a lot to do with construction. Construction in the period of its downturn lost 2.3 million jobs, and about 87% of construction workers are men. This time was different. It was leisure and hospitality, retail trade, daycare centers, salons, home health. A lot of female-dominated occupation categories were directly implicated by social distancing directives. And so in April of 2020, while the overall rate of unemployment is 14.7 to 14.8%, for women that month it's 16.1%, for men that month 13.6. Now you can see the improvement since that time. By June of 2021, the last data point here, we're down to 5.9% unemployment. And in fact, women have gained back a lot of those lost jobs. Now, this is somewhat misleading, that statistic, because since the beginning of the pandemic, the U.S. labor market has shrunk by several million people. So if you added those people back into the ranks of job seekers, the actual rate of unemployment would be closer to 8%. Nonetheless, if you flip this line upside down, and why on God's green earth would you do that, is because less is more here. The lower the number, the better. This is unemployment. So if you flip this line upside down, you would see the letter V. That's how quickly we have bounced back, at least partially bounced back. This is unemployment rates for those same 25 metropolitan areas, May of 2021. Now, here I want to point out one thing. Data can be misleading. Statistics can be misleading. Normally, we think a lower unemployment rate is a good thing. But these are not normal circumstances. So, again, the labor market has shrunk in many cases. And so a higher rate of unemployment in that context might mean that more people in the community are looking for work, and actually that portends well for the economic outlook to come. Because if there are more people available to fill jobs, actually those regions with more people available probably will end up adding jobs faster. So in any case, sort of pandemic economics are different from a typical economics. Now let's keep going. Let's keep talking about some of the things that occurred because of the pandemic. And one of the things that occurred is significant federal government involvement in the economy, more than usual. So if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that the government of witches and wizards is the Ministry of Magic. Very powerful, the Ministry of Magic. Now, I don't know how much magic comes out of Washington, D.C. I can tell you a lot of dollars do, and particularly last year into this year. 3 major stimulus packages passed in 2020. Here they are. The first one was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. That was signed by Donald Trump on March 27th of 2020, and this becomes the model for all subsequent packages. This is a $2.2 to $2.3 trillion package. This includes direct payments to Americans. This includes extended and enhanced unemployment insurance. This is your Paycheck Protection Program, loans and grants to businesses. Now, you might remember around that time, hospital systems, including in California, are overwhelmed by COVID-19 patients. There's not enough personal protective equipment. There's not enough intensive care unit beds. There's not enough ventilators. And so less than a month later, more stimulus is injected into the economy, one, to bulk up healthcare delivery capacity, but also more money for the Paycheck Protection Program, as those monies were lent out very, very quickly. But then for many months after April of last year, no new stimulus was legislated by Congress. So the economy starts to lose momentum as that stimulus had worked its way through the economy during the summer months. By the fourth quarter, the economy is starting to flail. So sensing that the economy is falling apart, Congress passes and Donald Trump signs, as it turns out he signs it on December 27th, the Consolidated Appropriations Act. This is a $906 billion package. Again, more direct payments to Americans, more extended and enhanced unemployment insurance, more loans and grants to businesses. Now, all of this news has been trumped by the latest stimulus package signed by Joe Biden on March 11th, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. This is a $1.9 trillion package. It includes direct payments to Americans. They all have done that. This third major stimulus package, this third one, they've all included direct payments, extended and enhanced federal unemployment assistance, but this one includes something different. So this one included $350 billion of direct aid to state and local government. And please don't get me wrong. There was a lot of money that flowed from the federal government to state and local governments last year, but it was prescribed money. It was designated for specific purposes, like the purchase of personal protective equipment for healthcare workers. This is different, this $350 billion. It's more in the nature of general fund relief. It's more in the nature of governor spend it in health, or Madam Mayor spend it wisely. Very few strings attached. And you might remember on Capitol Hill, those of you students of politics, that there was a raging debate on Capitol Hill about why we might not want to do this. Do you remember that? The notion was we don't want to bail out states like New Jersey and Illinois. Do you remember hearing those words? We don't want to bail out New Jersey and Illinois. As it turns out, there's a fair amount of antipathy for people from New Jersey and Illinois in this country, which I think is preposterous, given that those are most excellent people, at least those folks from Illinois. That package also includes more money for small businesses, public health, so on and so forth. And that's the stimulus money that's still working its way through the economy. Please keep in mind that about 40% of this package will be spent after the end of this federal fiscal year. The federal fiscal year ends on September 30th, and so a goodly amount of money will be spent for the fourth quarter of this year and then into 2022. So there'll be stimulus injected into the economy, even if the Biden administration doesn't get its American Family Plan passed or its infrastructure package passed. Of course, if it does get those packages passed, there'll be that much more stimulus going into 2022. Now, you could ask the question, and as many of you are young Americans, of course, you should ask the question, are we being Dumbledore? Albus Dumbledore, of course, the headmaster of Hogwarts School. Hogwarts made famous by the Harry Potter books and movies, the school for witches and wizards. We came into the crisis with a $23.5 trillion national debt. This chart suggested it's screaming towards $28 trillion, but as a practical matter, it's now past $28 trillion, headed towards $30 trillion, perhaps by the end of the current federal fiscal year. Now, I was taught in economics, there is no free lunch. There is no free lunch. So at some point, we're going to pay for this. Maybe not literally. We may not literally pay it back. But at some point, we Americans are going to pay the price for this national debt. At least that's what my economics theory has taught me. And so what might that look like? If the bond market revolts, as it did in Greece and Portugal and some other countries several years ago, if the bond market revolts, there are a few things the Americans can do. We can raise taxes, which generally speaking would be bad for real estate. We can cut federal spending, which would be bad for the economy, which would be bad for real estate, or we can print money. My guess is the Americans will print money. The Greeks couldn't do that because the Greeks could not do that because they don't work in drachmas anymore. They're part of the Eurozone. So they can't just print money. So they actually have to raise taxes and cut spending, driving their economy to a deep recession. We Americans, my guess, will print dollars and pay down debt. But that will trigger more inflation, less creditworthiness for the federal government, higher interest rates, and none of that actually, as it turns out, is particularly good for real estate. So, okay, set that aside. Let's keep moving along. And let's talk about some of the other behavioral shifts rendered by the crisis. So one of the other aspects of the pandemic has been that we have, as Americans, altered what we buy and where we buy it. So one of the aspects of last year, for instance, and this matters very much for real estate, at least retail real estate or commercial real estate, is that we suffered a lot of retail bankruptcy last year. Here's a list of some of the large retail bankruptcies sustained in 2020. So, for instance, back in February, before the crisis becomes one in North America, Pier 1 Imports goes bankrupt, closing all of its stores, so you can still buy their merchandise online. Then in April, True Religion, the supplier of those excellent jeans that make everyone look slender, they go bankrupt. Then sequentially in May of last year, J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, and JCPenney go bankrupt. That's a lot of real estate, by the way. That's a lot of store closures and a lot of empty retail space. Then in June, GNC, the maker of those supplements, or at least I should say the supplier of those supplements that people take to boost their health, to bolster their health. I mean, some of us take those pills to boost our musculature. I pop those pills like crazy. I sell the arms of an accountant for whatever reason. Brooks Brothers goes bankrupt in July. Lord & Taylor, that Halloween department store, goes bankrupt in August. And then late last year, Francesca's, which is one of my daughter's all-time favorites. So judging from their behavior, most of these are their all-time favorites. They go bankrupt in December. So lots of retail bankruptcy. But here's the thing. I could make the argument to you that last year was actually quite a good year for retail. And that the retail strength has prevailed into 2021. This is monthly retail sales. 21 years of data here back to May of 2000. So there was a period of weakness, don't get me wrong, in retail. And it starts in February of 2020. So if you look toward the right of the slide, you'll see a period of declining retail sales, that big gap that you see there. The first negative month there in terms of sales is February of 2020. So what's going on in February of 2020? Well, by this point, you and I have heard about COVID-19. Some people are beginning to withdraw from the economy, at least partially. And then as we shut down the economy in March and April in earnest, retail sales fall off the table. You can see that big dip there. But then, lo and behold, what you see, ladies and gentlemen, you see the letter V. By June of last year, retail sales are above the pre-recession peak, and then they keep growing. Now, you'll see a period of shrinking retail sales. Keep looking from the right of the slide. That's the fourth quarter of last year. Again, stimulus injected into the economy on December 27th, and by and large, retail has been ramping higher ever since. So, how do we reconcile that? Fairly strong retail performance over this whole period, because we couldn't take vacations, we couldn't go to ballparks and spend $8 on a hot dog or $10 on a beer. So we ended up buying a lot of stuff, a lot of retail items, whether online or in brick and mortar context, ultimately. How do we reconcile that with the fact that we suffered so much retail bankruptcy in 2020? Well, ask yourself the question, who won retail market share over the course of the pandemic? This is retail sales by type of business. Again, February 2020 versus June of 2021. So these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in retail sales for each of these categories for that 16-month period that we've been using. At the very top of the list, the best performer, actually a brick and mortar category. Sporting goods, hobby, book, and music stores. What is that about? That's about the sale of Peloton bikes and other exercise equipment. If people could not go to the gym, they brought the gym into the house. And number two, the internet. That's e-commerce. That's online sales. Obviously, the internet was a big winner, gaining market share last year. That's Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Jeff Bezos had an excellent year in 2020. Not romantically, but from a business perspective. Enough so that he could go to space today. He was up in space today and he's back. So the internet. And number three, motor vehicles and parts dealers. What's that about? That's your auto dealer. What's that about? They shut down mass transit. And there was also a rush to the suburbs that I'll talk about in just a moment. And number four, building materials, garden supply stores. Who's that? That's your Home Depot and your Lowe's. Because what did we do a lot of during the pandemic? We spent a lot of time at home. And what do people do when they're at home? They notice everything that's not right about their home. And that translates into somebody, whether a contractor or a homeowner, ending up in a Home Depot. And at the very bottom, you see the worst performer. We call it food services and drinking places. Food services and drinking places. That's a fancy way of saying restaurants and bars. So most human beings refer to that as restaurants and bars. We economists call that food services and drinking places, which are one of the many reasons many of us have never been on a date. And then moving up a few categories, you see clothing and clothing accessory stores. Now, the last couple of months, you've seen a lot of apparel sales, a lot of people buying clothes for the first time in many months. But during the early stages of the pandemic, clothing sales were way down. And why was that? We weren't going outside. Who are we trying to impress? Our families already know what we look like. There's no hiding that. And so that lines up neatly with the bankruptcies of your J. Crew and Francesca's and others that depend upon a true religion, J.C. Penney and others that depend upon apparel sales. One other thing I should note. During the pandemic, the worst of the pandemic, I should say, the economy was changing so quickly that many of us economists, along with other observers, were not simply satisfied looking at monthly or quarterly data as we normally do. We wanted high-frequency data. Here is some high-frequency data. This is U.S. restaurant reservations that comes out each and every day. It comes from OpenTable. So this squiggly green line reflects the percentage change in restaurant reservations from the same date in 2019. So if you look toward the left of the slide here, you'll notice that we go down to negative 100% in March and April of 2020. We basically shut down the restaurant industry completely. And that helps explain why we lost so many jobs in that leisure hospitality category, which embodies restaurant workers. Now, my staff back in Baltimore created this slide. My staff is mostly in their 20s and 30s, and they took the vertical axis down to negative 120%. And I need to tell them at some point, once we're in the office, that the most you can go down is negative 100%. But please set that aside. That is an internal staffing issue. You can see the bounce back in activity in May into June. But look at the series here. You see periods of improvement where we get back to 2019 levels or toward 2019 levels of restaurant reservations, and then a period in which we fade in terms of momentum. What's going on? We have had 4 viral surges. The first one, and maybe now a fifth, the current one may be the fifth, but the first one begins in March and April of last year. Then we had the summer surge in Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Southern California. Then we had the surge after Labor Day of last year, after everyone got back from vacations. Then we had a surge earlier this year. And now we're having, I guess, the 5th surge with this Delta variant popping up in various parts of the country. And what the data indicate is that you don't need a governor to tell you to stay home. A lot of people, once they see those infection rates start to pick up, they themselves partially withdraw from the economy. That's one of the reasons the stock market was down so much yesterday, particularly the airlines. because it's not about government mandates all the time. Sometimes it's just about people saying, you know what, I'm not getting on an airplane until this Delta variant goes away. And by the way, out of Latin America right now comes the Lambda variant. We'll see what that means for us during the months ahead. Okay, let's keep talking about this. Now, this might be the data in which you who are interested in real estate economics might have most interest. This is the real estate and construction part of the presentation. Now, if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that any student admitted into Hogwarts, again, that school made famous by the books and movies, any student admitted is allocated into one of four houses. There is Hufflepuff, there is Gryffindor. Indeed, Harry Potter and his two best friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, are members of Gryffindor House. I'm from Baltimore, and every wizard from Baltimore ends up in Ravenclaw. That's just the rule. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm just telling you what it is. If you're from Pittsburgh, you end up in Slytherin. And again, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm just telling you what it is. Now, one of the other aspects of economic life was the intervention by the Federal Reserve in the economy more aggressively than is normal. First, of course, they cut short-term interest rates they control to effectively 0%, and then they introduced, again, another round of quantitative easing, this time purchasing about $120 billion in bonds each and every month, and that helped to drive down, along with private sector forces, interest rates. Now, here I'm showing you two interest rates of interest. I'm showing you the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue and the 50-year fixed mortgage rate in red. Now, I don't think it would surprise any member of this esteemed audience that home prices were rising prior to the pandemic. Well, of course they were. So we had a foreclosure crisis that was attendant with the Great Recession and its aftermath. So a lot of people lost their homes, moved into rental units. Millennials were coming of age, entering ages during which they were leaving their parental households and moving into their own households and renting a lot of apartments. So that coincided neatly with the apartment building boom of the previous decade. And because a lot of the capital was going into apartment construction, and because of the foreclosure crisis, we didn't build a lot of new homes. So the inventory of available homes for sale was low coming into the pandemic. We hadn't built a lot, and the economy had been recovering for more than 10 years by that point. But there are other factors that were at work. Mortgage rates, as I say, were quite low, have been quite low during the pandemic. That induced more demand for housing. A lot of people wanted to social distance more aggressively during the pandemic, and it's easier to do that from a home than an apartment building. People wanted more space because we're spending more time at home. People wanted room for home offices and home gyms. So as it turns out, and I think this is somewhat surprising, the pace of home price appreciation accelerated during the pandemic. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index, and you can see that surge in home prices during this pandemic. Now, some people will tell you this is a bubble. They will tell you that this is akin to what happened in 2003, 2004, 2005, when the previous housing bubble was forming. Not so fast. Supply and demand. If you look at neighborhoods around this country, many neighborhoods at least, there's almost nothing available for sale. Demand is strong, perhaps made artificially strong by the pandemic, but it is strong. And so when you've got strong demand and not much supply, prices should rise, and they are. This is not like 2003, 2004, 2005, when people were flipping homes, speculatively building homes, all those kinds of things, getting fraudulent mortgages, interest-only mortgages, these kinds of things. This is a different circumstance. And so it's possible that these high home prices that we're seeing around the country, including, of course, in California, could fall at some point. But I think the real reason that would happen, if it happens, is because interest rates take off. Now, of course, that's not the story today or yesterday. Interest rates have continued to be very, very low across the bond yield spectrum. Now, naturally, when you've got so much demand and not much supply, this helps to trigger a supply response. And one of the things I want to do for you as I move toward the tail end of this presentation is I want to show you a bunch of leading economic indicators. Because ultimately, I want to get to a forecast for this audience. So here's a leading indicator. It's U.S. residential building permits. This is a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build something. So this reflects an intention to build. Now, the segment of interest here is the red segment that relates to single unit structures. That's your townhomes and your single family homes. If you look from the right of the slide, you'll notice that prior to the pandemic, there was a bit of surge in residential or single family residential building permits. Of course there was. The economy is strong. We're adding tons of jobs. Wages are growing in the context of a 50-year low in unemployment. And so there was an opportunity for builders to meet unmet demand. They're pulling permits. Early in the crisis, you can see a dip in permitting activity And part of that was because builders and developers were uncertain about the future, but part of that was because the government offices that issue such permits themselves were not necessarily fully functional during the early stages of the pandemic. But then what you see here, ladies and gentlemen, use the letter V. You see, so now I've shown you a few things. I've shown you the pace at which gross domestic product has rebounded. I've shown you the pace at which jobs came back, the pace at which unemployment fell, the pace at which retail sales came back, and now single-family building permits all manifesting that V-shaped trajectory. And you can see that the recovery has, by and large, continues. Permitting is above, single-family permitting at least, is above its pre-recession level. Now, you might have noticed, however, that in the last few months, permits are coming back down to earth. There's a lot of momentum. Why is that? Two-word answer to that, softwood lumber. But it's other materials prices too. It's gypsum and other materials that go into building a house. Almost everything that goes into building a house, whether it's labor or materials, has become more expensive recently. Now, softwood lumber prices have come back a bit, actually a significant amount recently, but still remain well above pre-pandemic levels. I've seen the article recently in Bloomberg indicating that in Boise, Idaho, which is a boom town where many Californians are moving to Boise, Idaho, that the price of concrete slab has risen by more than 100% since 2019. So it's not just softwood lumber. And so because costs are rising, it's difficult to make the economics work. For home builders, they're pulling back on permits. Now, one of the other phenomenon here is that Americans are pushing into the suburbs very aggressively. And obviously that has major implications for real estate. Whether you're leasing real estate, selling real estate, whatever it happens to be, the population movements determine a lot about where people are going to make money and where people are going to lose money. So this is in millions. You see the red bar there? That reflects the roughly 2 million people who moved out of principal cities last year. San Francisco, Boston, New York, Seattle, so on and so on, Chicago, Detroit. You see the blue bar here? That's a reflection of the 3 million people who moved into suburbs. Some from abroad, as some Americans came back from abroad because of the pandemic. Some from rural areas, don't have broadband. Many from urban areas. But the push was aggressively into the suburbs, and that has economic implications. And again, economic implications have real estate implications. What I would say to you is this, and you can push back on me. We'll get to Q&A in about 10 minutes. But I would say that the value of proximity has declined. So here's what I mean by that. Ask yourself the question: why is Manhattan so expensive? Proximity. Proximity to what? Massive labor market. In fact, the two largest central business districts in America are in Manhattan, the Financial District and Midtown. Central Park, Broadway, fabulous restaurants, views of New Jersey and Brooklyn. But in a world of remote working, or more pervasive remote working, more online shopping, and of course streaming of Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and Disney Plus and so on and so forth, proximity has lost some value. And that shows up in many different ways, including, for instance, in apartment rents. So this reflects the change in apartment rents in various communities around the country between March of last year and December of last year, that 9-month period, the last 9 months of last year. So what I'm trying to say in that left-hand column is between March and December of last year, rents in San Francisco fell 27%. Seattle, 22%. Boston, 21%. New York, 20%. Washington and San Jose, 15%. Los Angeles, around 8%. Now, rents are not declining everywhere. A lot of attention has been given, for instance, to the fact that California lost population last year for the first time in at least 120 years. But less attention has been given to the fact that a lot of Californians moved last year to other parts of California. So if I'm going to be watching Netflix much of my time, I don't need to live in San Francisco. I might as well be in Fresno. I don't need to be in Los Angeles. I can go to Bakersfield. So what we're seeing right now is greater diffusion of U.S. population, including into the suburbs. Now, you probably have heard that some people are starting to move back into the cities, whether Manhattan or other cities. That's true, but they're being induced into these cities often by those lower rents that prevail now compared to the pre-pandemic period. You can see the right-hand column, rents are not declining everywhere. So we economists have talked a lot about the fact that many people have been moving from cities to suburbs. We spent less attention talking about the fact that many people have moved from more expensive areas to less expensive areas. And part of the reason for that, of course, is remote work. And remote work is here to stay. We'll maybe have a chance to talk more about that during Q&A. Here's another way of looking at it. You see the dark purple line there? That's cumulative rent decline sustained in principal cities during the 12 months of last year. You see the light purple line? That's what happened in suburban cities. Rents are not declining there. So I'm from Baltimore. So our suburban cities are the likes of Columbia, Ellicott City, Towson, Hunt Valley, Lutherville, Timonium, White Marsh, Pikesville, Catonsville, Bel Air, Fallston, Severna Park, Annapolis. I could go on. I think I am. The point is this. That's not where the population is disappearing from. And so the rents in those markets, generally speaking, are stable. It's the principal cities where landlords, in some cases, are under pressure to lower rents because they're dealing with higher vacancy. Another leading indicator here, but now this one pertains largely to commercial construction. This is the Architecture Billings Index, a product of the American Institute of Architects. It's based on a survey of several hundred architects each month. You see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading above 50 means that architects are busier this month than they were last month. Now, why is this a leading indicator? Because if architects are busier this month or over the last few months, if they're busier doing design work, that translates ultimately into contractors doing more construction work downstream. So architects busy upstream, contractors busier downstream. Now you can see during much of the pandemic, architects were busily getting less busy. The reading was less than 50. Last 4 months have been better. And all this liquidity floating around the economy, thank you, Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, has to end up someplace. Some of it ends up in the stock market. Some of it ends up in the bond market, which is why you can have so much inflation in the economy and still have such low interest rate. Some of it ends up in real estate. And you've got a pretty active real estate market right now, even though we're down 7 million jobs nationally, even though the labor force is not as large as it used to be. Now, don't get me wrong. This is a proxy for non-residential construction spending. So if you look at this is put in place, 15 years of data here, but if you look at these bars, so the dark blue segment is private non-residential construction spending. The light blue is public, that's government. And where we've seen the decline is in those private segments. And, you can imagine some of these behavioral changes have negatively impacted the office market, things like remote working. Things like Zoom business meetings have impacted the hotel sector. Leisure travel is coming back with a vengeance, of course. Americans are out there spending a fair amount of money on leisure travel, but business travel, my guess is, will not come back very, very rapidly or as rapidly. And then, of course, online shopping continues to affect the retail construction segment. Now, as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, and part of my goal tonight is to expose you to different sources of data. So I don't know if you've seen these sources of data or not. This happens to come from the U.S. Census Bureau, as does the data on the next slide. So as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are reflected here. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in construction spending for the 5-year period spanning from February 2015 to February of 2020. So what I'm trying to get at with this slide is what did we build a lot of during the 5 years coming into the pandemic? Now, at the very top is public safety. Typically, the public safety category includes prisons, jails, fire stations, and police stations. But what really drove the spending higher in this case was all that emergency spending to bulk up healthcare capacity. So we spent a lot of money, for instance, turning convention centers into temporary hospitals. That construction expenditure showed up in the public safety category as opposed to, let's say, healthcare, which is down below. But notice what else we built a lot of? Office space. We built a ton of office space just before this pandemic, and now we know that many people are as productive or more productive working from home than in the office, which is filled with distraction. Whether the office is filled with distraction, so is the home. Neighbors, pets, children, daytime soaps in the sports center, but offices also have lots of distraction, impromptu staff meetings, play solitaire, all those kinds of things that you see in a typical office setting. And then lodging, which is the third category, that's new hotel room construction. So we built a ton of hotel rooms, and now we can conduct business via Zoom. I think one of the big things going on here is that a lot of people actually like conducting business via Zoom. They don't want to get on an airplane and go someplace to conduct business. They like sitting back in their home office or their professional office and, having meetings and then going back to their family that evening. Or, the other thing is that a lot of people like working from home. They like to have flexible time. They like to be able to take in their dry cleaning, all those kinds of things, watch their children, of course. And so that has all kinds of real estate implications as well. Now, this slide, same 16 categories, but now I'm showing you what happened during the pandemic. So the percentage change in non-residential construction spending by category between February of 2020, pre-pandemic crisis month, versus May of 2021, the last month for which we have these data. The June data will come out in early August. And you can see at the very bottom, public safety, because, we're closing down the mass vaccination sites now. We're no longer prepared for a pandemic. We have been treating it as if it's past. Of course, it's not past. And then lodging, lack of hotel room construction, because developers in that space are quite wary. You also see a big dip in the office space category. Construction spending in that category down 14.3%. That, again, is misleading. Why? Because the office space category also embodies data centers. Now, data center construction, along with fulfillment center construction, is hot and heavy. We don't have enough warehouse space in this country by several hundred million square feet. And Amazon, of course, is a principal reason for that. So the flex space, the data center space in the office category is, of course, keeping that figure artificially elevated. It's a traditional office space category that we're really seeing a decline, but that's sort of hidden by that overall negative 14.3% figure. Is actually much worse for traditional office space construction than that figure suggests. And here's another thing. I have been surprised by the confidence I hear among many construction firms. So many construction firms, and one of the things I do is I'm the chief economist for Associate Builders and Contractors in Action, and also the Construction Financial Management Association. So I work in a lot of construction economics. And our contractors tell me our backlog is up, meaning the contract yet to be done, that we expect for the next 6 months to see our sales rise, our employment. Yes.
Oh, no, I'm not closing my eyes to listen to him.
Oh, it's George. George, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Good, George.
Good.
I hope you're enjoying the presentation. So as I say, so our contractors tell us that they expect sales to rise over the next 6 months. They expect employment to rise over the next 6 months. We're going to be hiring more people. But here's the big thing. They expect their profit margins to expand in the next 6 months. Now, why do I find that amazing? Because the cost of construction is rising so rapidly. And in fact, if you were with us during the conversation that preceded this webinar, actually it was George who made the point that some of these construction costs are on the rise, and that's what's reflected here. So this is inputs to construction producer price index data. It's a measure of inflation. And what this says is between June of 2020 and June of 2021, on that year-over-year basis, materials prices were up 25%. Now, your experience may be different from this because some markets are hotter than others. So Boise and Nashville are hotter than, let's say, Boston or New York or Seattle or Portland. So you might find that materials prices are increasing more in some regions than others. Again, you have to be very careful about how you interpret data. But we can break this down further. So same data source here, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but this is now the Construction Materials Producer Price Index. Again, 12-month percentage change. So what I'm trying to say here is that the price of softwood lumber through June was up 125%, according to government data. You'll find other private data that have different statistics. So that's one thing you need to recognize. There are many sources of data purporting to report on the same thing, and they often disagree. I'll give you a very good example. I mentioned very early in the presentation that in June, our nation added 850,000 jobs. That's from the payroll survey or the establishment survey, the survey of employers. But if you look at the household survey, which is what produces the unemployment rate, the same period, according to the household survey, was associated with a loss of 18,000 jobs, as opposed to the growth of the addition of 850,000 jobs. So the surveys were completely different. Most of us economists simply throw away the household survey because we view it as not particularly reliable, and we use the establishment survey data typically. But again, is it wise to simply ignore data like that? Maybe yes, maybe no. So softwood lumber up more than 100%. Crude petroleum, natural gas, steel mill products. So by some measures, steel prices have more than tripled since the beginning of the pandemic. Iron and steel prices, you can see here. And as I say, even though concrete product prices only look like they've gone up about 5% over this 12-month period, again, if you look at that recent Bloomberg article, it's based on a study of the Boise market. In Boise, according to them, concrete slab prices up more than 100% since 2019. Okay, let's hit the home stretch and then we can open up for Q&A. Let me do some crystal balling for you. So we economists tend to excessively complicate matters, and we do this on purpose. The notion is that if you can't understand what we're saying, you will deem us to be highly intelligent. But really in economics, it boils down to two things, and this never changes, has not changed for hundreds of years. It is demand and supply, and that's it. And in America, the principal source of demand is household spending. The principal source of demand is household spending. And so you've heard the statement a million times, the consumer is 2/3 of the economy. What they really are 2/3 of aggregate demand. And so the consumer is of such outsized importance that we don't just monitor their behavior, how they're spending, what they're buying. We actually monitor their psychology. Are they happy? Do they like the president? Are they confident? Here's the University of Michigan's index of consumer sentiment. So when the folks in Michigan are not being handled by Ohio State, they like to produce this index. It's the other thing they do. And the consumer psychologically is almost precisely where you would think they would be. They're not as despondent as they were early in the crisis, but they're not as confident as they were prior to the pandemic. But I can make the case, and I think, again, this matters a lot for real estate dynamics going forward, as well as broader economic dynamics. I can make the case that the American household has never been in better financial shape. Now, at some level, that sounds very insensitive, doesn't it? Because you and I know that many Americans are facing food insecurity for the first time in their lives, having to go to food pantries to eat. I and you know that many people lost their health insurance during the pandemic when they needed it most. I and you know that many people are struggling with student debt. Many are struggling with credit card debt. That many people are facing evictions as these various moratoria expire. But from a macroeconomic perspective, so that's the microeconomics. Individual families may be suffering in some cases. That's obviously true. Millions of families are. But I'm speaking macroeconomically, collectively, from an economy-wide perspective. And from an economy-wide perspective, again, you could make the argument, household has never been in better financial shape. This is the U.S. savings rate. This is savings as a percentage of personal disposable income. What this really represents is how much money people take out of their paychecks every couple of weeks and set aside into some account. Could be a 401k, could be savings, could be checkings, but they're saving it. They're not spending it right away. Coming into the crisis, the U.S. savings rate is around 7 to 8%. By April of 2020, that's the biggest peak you see here, it's 33.7%. What's going on here? Well, not everyone loses their job. Some people are able to work remotely, for instance. Some people keep working at Walmarts and grocery stores and so on and so on. Many people continue to work in the construction industry, deemed by many communities to be an essential industry. Many people who are unemployed are receiving stepped-up unemployment insurance benefits. And at that time, early in the pandemic, $600 a week on top of their state unemployment insurance benefits, $600 a week from the federal government. And then, of course, many people get those stimulus payments. Not everybody, but many people. So money is coming to the household, but it's not money that's easily spent. The malls are closed. The restaurants are closed. The ballparks are closed. The theaters are closed. So the savings sort of accumulate on the household balance sheet. Now, as the economy reopens and fits and starts and spending opportunities reemerge, those savings turn to expenditures, the economy takes off with that V-shaped recovery. But as late as May of 2021, the savings rate is still a lofty 12.4%. So Americans are still saving money. And according to the most recent data, the American households have saved $2.6 trillion in excess savings beyond what they normally would have accumulated. So that's money ready to be spent. And yet, you talk to many people operating in the economy, including businesses, and they say not everything is perfect right now. It doesn't feel completely right. The recovery still feels somewhat constrained. And again, we added a disappointing number of jobs in April and May. So there's two things, demand and supply. Many of you are too young to remember, but in 1988, the great rapper Rob Bass released a song called It Takes Two to Make a Thing Go Right. It takes two to make a thing go right, which is basically his way of talking about the performance of the economy. It takes demand and supply. Now, some of you might point out, those of you who are musical historians, that production also included one DJ Easy Rock. And you're right, it was a duo. It was two of them, and I'm not trying to take away credit here. Of course, it takes two to make a thing go right. Of course, it was a duo. Now, Rob Bass gets all the attention because his name is in the song. I'm Rob Bass, and I came to get down. But no. Now, as it turns out, DJ Easy Rock passed in 2014 from diabetic seizure, proving once again that it takes two to make a thing go right, but only one to make a thing go terribly wrong. In any case, demand is great. The consumer is ready to spend. So what's the problem here? If there's not demand, what must it be? It must be supply. You've heard about all these global supply chain disruptions, rising shipping costs, rising trucking costs, all the shortages of computer chips, chlorine tablets, all kinds of things in the economy. Because there's such a shortage of computer chips, we can't produce enough cars. Used car prices are 45% over the past year. 45%. So the supply side of the economy has not been able to keep up with the demand side. That's why softwood lumber prices are so high. That's why steel prices are so high. It's a global phenomenon. It's not simply an American phenomenon. One of the other aspects of economic life is many small businesses are not that confident right now. This is the National Federation of Independent Businesses Index of Small Business Optimism. Question Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In June, only 15% of small business operators said, yes, it's a good time to expand my business. In February, it was 6%. So it's getting a bit better, but still not great. So a lot of these small businesses are hoarding cash. They're finding that workers are difficult to recruit. Their input prices have increased. If they're a food processor, food prices are way up, for instance, that kind of thing. And so what that translates into is a supply side that's not ready to really fully participate. And of course, it takes two to make a thing go right. So for an economy to flourish, both demand and supply sides of the economy must participate. If the Biden administration is able to pass some of these stimulus packages, well, demand will get a further boost. The supply will continue to be constrained by numerous factors, and not just in America. Again, global supply chains are in disarray in many cases. The result is that the U.S. savings rate will remain elevated in the short term, and that will continue to spring-load the economy for rapid economic growth once vaccines become more broadly available globally, as this is a global pandemic. I still believe that the back half of 2021 will be spectacular for economic growth, despite the Delta variant. That suppliers right now with these elevated prices have an incentive to increase output and capacity ultimately. That translates into a lot of business investment. You get a lot of consumption growth, lots of government spending, lots of business investment, more exports as the global economy expands. U.S. economy, U.S. GDP grows rapidly. However, there will be a day of reckoning as deficit hawks come back into fashion. If you're going to go into real estate development, then you need to think long and hard about what it means to have a national debt of this size and when a bond market crisis might come. But set that aside, that is not a 2021 or 2022 issue. It would appear based on the bond market's behavior. I'll leave it at that. Let's go to Q&A. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Professor.
Thank you so much. That was great. So please ask him some questions.
Yes, if you'd like. It's the fourth quarter of the game, by the way, so we'll see. It's getting pretty dramatic out there, but a few minutes of Q&A, you'll still be able to catch the rest of the fourth quarter. So any questions out there?
George, you want to ask him something? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am. I'm look there. Yeah, I'm interested in, and absolutely, it's all true. I mean, construction cost, as you say, I have noticed, from our preliminary bids on a project to where we are, it's almost a 30-40% increase in cost. And in a matter of from going back to October of last year, and then it just spiked with all the commodities. As you say, the economy opened up a little bit, and and when would you project? You say have demand, but it's supply, and supply is caused by a supply chain issue. How long will that take to?
Yeah.
Did you take the Olympics for Bethany?
She didn't tell me to.
Well, we could join in. She wants.
Oh, okay. I can take that for her.
Was it an email or a text?
What? Yeah, I know.
deciding that maybe they found other jobs that are more stable because they got hurt in the industry. But it is hard to find even labor, and I'm finding that unbelievable. Is that caused by all the government give outs? Is that really led to a lot of people saying I can stay home and with these extended unemployments and all the other benefits they get? Is there some truth to that? It seems to be a political ploy, but is that borne out by any other statistic?
Yeah, so there was a raging debate in the economics community about whether or not these enhanced unemployment insurance benefits have caused people to de-emphasize job search and to stay unemployed longer. Now, look, like I say, it's a raging debate. There are studies in both directions. I believe very strongly that those stepped-up unemployment insurance benefits have induced many people to stay out of the labor market. And that's one of the reasons that employers are having such a difficult time filling jobs. Again, there's a big debate about that, but I'm not like most economists. I run my own business. I make payroll every 2 weeks, and I can feel it. I can see it in the labor market. But there's more than that. There's childcare. There's lingering fears of infection. Remember, a lot of people are scared of the vaccine, but they're also scared of being infected, right? In some sense, they're trapped. They don't know what to do, so they continue to stay withdrawn from the economy. So all kinds of factors work. And here's another point I think that is affecting employers. That I heard one economist say very intelligently that from the perspective of job seekers have become more like shoppers in terms of picking a job. They become very choosy. Now, we've always selected. I didn't grow up wanting to be a coal miner, for instance. I wanted to be an economist, but my point is they're choosier than normal. And so they want all kinds of they want flexibility. They want an opportunity to work from home a couple of days a week. They want a certain level of pay. They want a certain level of benefits, so on and so forth. And it's hard for them to find a job that satisfies all of that, checks all of those boxes. So it's taking employers longer time to fill jobs. And again, one of the things that gives people the luxury of being choosier about the jobs they fill are those extended and enhanced unemployment insurance benefits. So again, those benefits run out in every state on September 6th. So about half of the states have already truncated those benefits to some degree. And what we see, those states that have already done that, so stop those federal programs, now have lower unemployment than the states that haven't. And that suggests that the states that stopped those stepped-up unemployment insurance benefits saw the people of their states more aggressively look for jobs as those benefits were taken away from them.
And my partner and I both tend to agree that although there's going to be a day of reckoning because you can't keep the debt levels going up, and eventually the bond market or political, China's going to quit buying our paper. Somewhere down the line, it's going to be, it's going to be trouble. We're hoping. I'm hoping on my personal level because I got to refinance the loan, and we can't refinance it. It's a CMBS loan, so we can't finance it until actually this July of 2021. So we got to keep our existing loan. We're trying to hold on, trying to make sure interest rates are going to hold at least relatively well during that time period. So, we're gambling with not sure to do.
Well, but I think look, I can't tell you that the 10-year Treasury yield is going to stay at 1.2%.
No.
But what I can say is that there's so much liquidity out there. And remember, the Federal Reserve is not being on a taper yet. So they're still engaging in $120 billion of bond purchases each and every month. And they will through the period that you're going to have to refinance or collateralized mortgage-backed security. So I would not expect interest rates to explode anytime soon. And the most amazing thing about this macroeconomically has been that we have inflation of 5.2%, and the yield on the 10-year Treasury is around 1.2%. And that's not supposed to happen in economics. But the same phenomenon that is causing inflation, all this money supply increase, all this liquidity in the marketplace, and this surge in demand, is the same thing that's keeping interest rates low. All that liquidity and the fact there's so much money that's willing to sit around in bonds and keep those interest rates lower than normal.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting times. With what's going on, and some of our tenants have the same problem, and we have also noticed instantly that, and it verifies with a lot of people staying home, the population centers in residential areas are holding, and our restaurant sales have gone up, especially during the day, because people are home. They're not commuting into Denver and they're still working from home, and they still want to go out to lunch sometimes. So they're, they'll in the restaurant. So there's more activity during the day, which has been benefiting some of my tenants. So I have a shopping center in Littleton, Colorado, so it's southwest of downtown Denver. So,
and I'm sure many of your tenants have also embraced the curbside pickup. Curbside pickup is
that was certainly during the pandemic. It was mandatory at that time, and
but it's here to stay. It's here to stay because the consumers become accustomed to that.
Mm-hmm.
They like it, and I think a lot of restaurants would be wise to continue to offer curbside pickup. It doesn't sound like elegant, but it works somehow.
Yeah, and then Dash is all the Grubhub and all those things. I think
DoorDash and all that, right?
So really worked into the economy where people can order it up. The restaurants aren't as happy because they hard to raise their price to cover the margins of that profit. Because you can't have two menus of you have a price for your taco, but you end up they're having some issues with that. But that's an interesting one of how they handle that. So
DoorDash is remarkable. DoorDash created 3 billionaires.
Yeah.
So that business that's a real thing.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. It's fascinating to see that. So I'm not a business operator, but we rent to. I got several, but a number of them, and so we get a good sense of the economy by reaction to how they're doing and what their business model is. So it's fascinating. The daycare has got great young children, but they're after school. With school stopped, that whole part of his market fell apart. And so he's waiting for school to start again, where the kids have to go to school, and then and it'll be interesting because some of the parents would want the kid to go after school because they're not home, and they may be home now, so it's going to adjust his market, and he's trying to figure that one out.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Again, one of the reasons I think that the back half of the year will be very strong economically is the combination of getting rid of the stepped-up unemployment insurance benefits should induce more people to more aggressively engage in job search, should allow the supply side of the economy to function a bit better. And the other thing, of course, is as kids return to school for in-person instruction, all of a sudden those childcare responsibilities will be diminished, and people can also, moms and dads can, embrace the labor market more aggressively.
Yeah, no, it'll be fascinating, but it really is in my situation is monitoring the construction costs and what's going on and just the trades, because I think they have been very, very profitable, as you say. All the residential developments and all the home improvements have overwhelmed maybe I'm sure they're still going on to some degree. So that's one of my issues that I have to contemplate and figure out. So that's the way it is.
Are there any other questions here? I see, Jillian, I see you're there. Jamal, I know you're out there. I don't know if you're watching the game or not. Cassandra, I know you're out there. So, Mark, Daniel, I know you're out there.
I got a question.
Please.
And then I hope someone else will participate. You talked about the day of reckoning. How far out and what is going to be, Armageddon?
Yeah, purely speculative, but I want to put out some potential dates. So one is 2026. Now, why do I say that? That's the year that the Medicare Trust Fund goes insolvent. Now, insolvency is there for bankruptcy, but at that point, Medicare will only be able to pay about 75% to 80% of its promised benefits. So it's going to need an infusion of cash. So we've been taking money out of trust funds. Now, all of a sudden, the federal government is going to have to push money into these trust funds. And that's going to put some pressure on budgeting in Washington, D.C. So I think the bond market at that point might demand some evidence of fiscal discipline in Washington, D.C., which, of course, we have not had for many, 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 many years. Perhaps since fiscal year 2001, the last time we ran a federal budget surplus in this country. So that's one. Another possibility is 2034 or 2035. That's the year that the Social Security Trust Fund was insolvent according to the most recent trustees' report. And again, another very big trust fund and another major issue. So, and there could be other, we've got a debt ceiling issue next month. So, they've got to raise the debt ceiling. Of course, Democrats and Republicans don't work too well together to do those kinds of things, right? And so one of the things that the Republicans might want to do is to cause that kind of fiscal crisis to try to hamstring the Biden administration in terms of passing those packages. Again, I'm not saying that one side is right, one side is wrong. I mean, that's for people to decide for themselves. But that kind of gridlock in Washington, D.C. can cause some panic in the bond market, which is, by the way, what happened in 2011 when we had a bit of a debt downgrade at that time because of a technical default. So anyway, that's my answer. And some economists will say 2030. There's this sort of voodoo economics out there. There's a superstition around 2030 that we have these long-term cycles, and that every 150 years or so the economy falls apart. And so it fell apart in 1880, as it turns out. So 2030 is the year. I don't believe in that stuff, but I throw it in there for you.
Anyone else out there? Please ask your question.
I got a question. Any thoughts on the cost of the climate impact, the fires, the floods, all the strains that are taking place right now? Could you comment? And I have some offline comments from being from New Jersey I'll take later.
Oh, no. I have in-laws in New Jersey, and every chance I get to insult their community, I take that opportunity. So, and I'm so glad when it's recorded. So, so it can be played into perpetuity. But what are the economic impacts of climate change, global warming, so on and so forth? From a real estate perspective, I think the biggest impact has been on the insurance costs. Obviously there's some development impacts as well, because if you can't insure a particular property in a particular area, whether it's on the waterfront or an arid desert or arid forest, whatever it happens to be, then of course it can't be developed. So the insurance market affects development patterns. So I think that's where the impact has been greatest thus far. I mean, you could point to other impacts as well, but I think that's the greatest impact. And those impacts seem to me will be getting worse. Now, global warming, climate change, drought, so on and so forth, you can see that in some communities in the western part of the United States, they're actually shutting down development now. So, I mentioned earlier to the professor that Professor Abelson, that the Wall Street Journal had an article today about a community in Utah that has been growing rapidly heretofore, but has now shut down development. They will not be permitting any new units to hook into municipal water and sewer, and that's because they're having water shortages. So if you don't have water, you can't get insurance. That's going to really truncate development. I'm from the East Coast, so when I see that places like Utah and other, Arizona, so on and so forth, might not be able to develop the way they have in the past because of these water issues, even Texas, maybe that means that we can retain more of our population in Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, so on and so forth. So that all impacts where population lives, where growth can take place, and of course, you've got those insurance issues I talked about. So those are some of the big impacts thus far.
But doesn't the marketplace kind of absorb that? When a friend went to go buy a place in Temecula, California, it was next to a fire zone. The builder insured the house because nobody else would insure it. When you buy a Tesla, your insurance goes up. Tesla will offer you their own insurance. So doesn't the marketplace kind of take care of its own in that regard?
Yeah, but who's bearing the risk?
Yeah.
So the supply side is taking the risk off the consumer. That's fine, but is that a viable business model? So what happens when that house burns down? Will that builder actually have the wherewithal to pay that homeowner back, or will they simply go bankrupt?
Well, not to belabor the point, but that's what happened in Paradise, California. It bankrupted the insurer. So that's always the case, that if it's cataclysmic and you take a big hit as the insurer, you're out. Or whether it's that little builder doing a self-insure. So, okay.
Yeah, but there's a big difference in the balance sheet between a traditional insurer, right? Insurance balance sheets are looked at by regulators, analyzed for their strength, the capacity, so on and so forth. But a builder, an individual builder, there's not that kind of oversight. Yeah. And so I think it's just that kind of model would make me very nervous, and I would not want to purchase insurance from that type of insurer. I want to be insured by a top-notch insurer. Give me Mass Mutual, fantastic balance sheet. Not some kind of developer who says, you know what, I want to hope for the best.
New Jersey Manufacturers, #1 rated insurance company.
Doesn't surprise me. What a fabulous state it is. The Garden State. The Garden State, it is a paradise. I'm quite sure that the initial residents of the Garden State were Adam and Eve.
The license plate says it all. Great presentation.
Thank you very much.
Kevin, you want to say something? Come on.
No, I was just curious about, you mentioned, especially when we look at wage increases, overall inflation. The Fed doesn't seem to be too worried about it, but everything points to inflation increasing over the next couple of years. And I just was curious what your take was on that.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve has stuck by its story that this is transitory, and that this is simply because of a demand shock in the economy, and the supply side can't keep up with that demand shock. But eventually, there will be equilibrium, and the surplus inflation will go away. By and large, I think they're right, but there are some what I would call semi-permanent inflationary factors, and the number one factor in my mind is the labor market. So we're just not seeing labor force participation bounce back the way that I think the Federal Reserve had thought it would. The labor force participation rate in this country is 61.6%. It's stuck there. And one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is a lot of baby boomers retired early. Some because their 401k got fat. Some because they lost their job and they said, "That's it. I'm done. I'm out of this game." So, but in any case, the baby boomers have been among our most productive workers, particularly in industries like mining, manufacturing, energy, construction, so on and so forth. They are disproportionately the plumbers, electricians, welders, machinists, mechanics, truck drivers, and they've retired in large numbers. So if that part of the labor force doesn't come back aggressively, labor's going to cost more. And that's wage push inflation. I think you're going to see more of that this decade. What can I tell you? I think the Federal Reserve is to a certain extent wrong that not all this inflation is transitory. Some of it is. Steel prices, soft lumber prices, they can't stay this high forever. But some of this inflation is not transitory. And so what I would expect as an economist is that interest rates during the decade to come are going to be higher on average than the previous decade. So of course, again, we're looking at a 1.2% 10-year treasury yield today. But eventually, I think interest rates will move to the upside. That's at least what economists would suggest. But economics has not been a great predictor of things thus far.
Some more questions, please. Jillian, Cassandra, Jamal, Daniel. Nobody else? Lee, you got anything to say?
So what is your forecast for interest rates?
So my forecast for interest rates is, same as every other economist on the planet. They will rise from current levels. It's just that we've been saying that for months, and they've been falling from current levels, at least very recently. It is true that last year there was a period during which the 10-year yield was around 0.6%, and it's now double that. So I guess there's that. But with the Federal Reserve just buying so many bonds, with there just being so much liquidity in the market, until the Federal Reserve says, you know what, we're actually going to start implementing tapering. We remember we had the taper tantrum in 2013 when the Federal Reserve announced that they were going to truncate their bond repurchase program. When the Federal Reserve starts to talk about that in earnest, that's where I think you'll see yields take off, as they did in 2013. But right now, the Federal Reserve has said that we're talking about tapering, about slowing down these bond purchases. And so given that, I think interest rates will be quite flat going forward, even with this rampant inflation, or rampant by the previous decade standards, by the 1970s standards. But I would predict that over the next 2 to 3 years, interest rates are headed meaningfully higher, and that at some point on the 10-year, you get towards 2.5%, which would be, roughly double where we are today. But let's face it, the bond market just not behaved as economic theory would predict, for years now, and that's certainly been the case during the pandemic. So your guess is as good as mine.
Stephen, do you have any questions?
I do. I remember watching a presentation by one of the analysis firms last year that was showing the different level of impact on different income groups, and basically saying that for workers or households that were earning over $60,000 a year, the economic impacts were limited. And as you go down the income spectrum, the impacts were much worse, with greater unemployment, greater exposure to volatile sectors like food service and so on. That was a year ago, and I was wondering if that trend is still evident, or has the economic impact or has the recovery started to affect all levels of household income, or is the recovery more concentrated in certain income earning households?
Right. So there were, of course, enormous wealth and income disparities coming into the crisis, which I think it was the New York Times or Wall Street Journal that had an article today about CEOs making 9 figures over the past year, meaning $100 million or more. Enormous disparities coming into the crisis, and then the crisis widened those disparities. So home prices went. So if people were fortunate enough to own assets coming into the crisis, they benefited. Their 401k got fatter. Their T. Rowe Price portfolio or Fidelity portfolio got fatter. Their home prices went up in value. It's if they had a second or third home, even more so, right? So, I mean, in terms of total equity gains. But of course, the increases in stock prices, it's still the case that not quite 50% of American households don't have any stock. It's almost 50% don't have any stock. And of course, home ownership is far lower than it was, let's say, in 2004 when it peaked at 69.4%. So the gap between the haves and have-nots widens. On top of that, the industries that lost the most jobs were industries that offer a lot of entry-level and near entry-level occupations. So retail, trade, restaurants, hotels, daycare centers, salons, so on and so forth. That's where we saw the biggest job loss. So you put it all together, man, the white-collar worker with assets came out pretty well. They could work remotely, less likely to lose a job, had assets that appreciated value. But entry-level, near entry-level workers, many of whom are millennials, they lost jobs in large numbers and they didn't benefit from the increased assets. In fact, they're penalized by that. Why? Because now it's even more difficult for them to save up enough money to purchase a home. So 10 years ago, the average age of a first-time home buyer was 30. Now it's 33. So they're having to wait longer and longer to purchase a home. It takes them longer to save up their 20% down payment, for instance. So, so have things improved in the last few months? They have. Why? Because now we're starting to see those industries that were most hammered by the early stages of the pandemic, retail, trade, leisure, hospitality, come back rapidly. And employers are scrambling to try to cobble together workforces during this busy summer season. So leisure travel is way up, restaurant volume is way up. So the raises we're seeing, the increase in compensation we're seeing in the restaurant sector, in the hotel sector, are massive right now. That's closing that income gap. So we're seeing a fair amount of income growth among the lowest quintile of earners. Then you've got major employers like Amazon that offer $15 an hour minimum wages. That was unthinkable a few years ago. $15 an hour is a minimum, and actually the average entry-level worker coming into Amazon right now is making $17 an hour on average. And that's, many small businesses are trying to compete with that, and they're having to increase, compensation to try to keep up with the Amazons of the world. So again, those lower wage or entry-level workers are seeing more pay increases. So the gaps are starting to close just a bit. And that's wonderful. So what do we want to see? We want to continue to see fast job growth, more people jumping back into the labor market, rapid wage increases, even after, those unemployment insurance benefits go away. Because one of the theories here is that employers are having to compete with those stepped-up unemployment insurance benefits, and that's why they're having to offer more payment. After September 6th, that debate goes away. So I'm pleased by that. But the fact of the matter is, between technology and globalization, my guess is in the longer term, the disparities between haves and have-nots will continue to widen. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on are going to put a lot of people out of work and empower a lot of other people to become billionaires. And some of these people like Jeff Bezos has all the fun, going into space, and Elon Musk is, has all the fun, so Tom Brady has all the fun.
Anyone else? Come on. Well, we got him. Is the game over yet?
It's just about over. Milwaukee is winning, but
All
that's
right.
not important. Is that important? I don't think that's important. What matters is interest rates. Equilibrium in the money market and the goods market. That's what matters.
Question. Are we going to see a housing bubble?
Nope. No, it's not a housing bubble because the laws of demand and supply are such that it's really supply that is the problem here. We don't have enough supply. So as I say, back in 02, 03, 04, 05, there was a home building frenzy in this country. And demand was artificially stimulated by the flippers or speculators, and by the fact that many people were receiving mortgages that did not pass muster.
Sure.
No document loans, your interest-only mortgages. Just people were being lent far too much money. That's a hackneyed story. Everyone knows that story. But what happened is demand was artificially stimulated, and it looked like it was an equilibrium in the housing market. There wasn't. we oversupplied. The demand really wasn't there. As the demand evaporates, as basically, people start missing their mortgage payments. An ungodly proportion, by the way, of people who were foreclosed upon missed their first mortgage payment. They missed their first mortgage payment. So that just gives you some sense of the kind of fraud that was taking place in the mortgage-making market. This is different. As far as I can tell, lending standards continue to be quite disciplined, particularly if you're trying to get Freddie and Fannie backing for a mortgage. And if you look at the inventory of unsold homes in many communities, it's less than 1 month. There's just not enough homes for sale. And I think 50% of recent home sales in much of the country have been above asking price. And that sounds like a bubble, but it's simply the laws of supply and demand. There's not enough housing out there, and so you see these bidding wars. By the way, Milwaukee is winning 103-96 with 44.7 seconds. Go ahead. Next question.
Anyone else? Jillian, Cassandra, Jamal? Well, I want to thank you once again. That was great. We're very pleased to have you, and hopefully we can have you again sometime.
Yes. And I would, if you want to do it earlier in the day, I'm happy to do that. But
Yeah.
even now, it's 11:38 here in Baltimore, and I'm still awake.
It's just, I'm sort of. This is supposed to be my meeting time for the class because of the live stream component and that. But maybe you can do it sometime. Are you available on weekends?
I hesitate to say yes,
Okay.
because it'll give you some sense that I don't have a social life, and I don't. I'm married, but yeah, sure, I'm available on weekends theoretically, and this presentation, I'm as close to tomorrow now as I am to today. So
Okay.
I'm willing to do whatever it takes. If I have a chance to engage young people, I'd love to do that.
Thank you so much. It was very comprehensive,
Right.
very enlightening, and it's good to hear some optimism.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still America. Reason to be optimistic. So yeah, we somehow find a way. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you all, Jillian and Cassandra, Jamal, Martin, Daniel, everyone. It's been a privilege, and I hope to see you again. Best of luck in all of your endeavors.
Thank you so much again.
Right on.
Thank
Be well.
you.
Take care. Good night.